ancient Greeks first began beautifying interiors with ornate columns and moldings shaped from plaster. Decorative moldings were a popular design feature in much of Europe from roughly the 17th century onward, with Italian tradesmen becoming famous for their mastery at plasterwork. Specialists in traditional plasterwork are a rare breed these days. But that's who you need to hire to properly repair plaster moldings in a heritage home or to craft plaster moldings from scratch. To repair this damaged ceiling medallion, the plasterman first saws and chisels off the problem portion, clearing a flat work surface. Then he drives in screws part way to anchor the new portion of molding. The heavier a plaster molding, the more screws you need to hold the load. Another plasterman, meanwhile, prepares the plaster. The first ingredient is lime compound, a simple mixture of lime, also known as calcium hydroxide, and water. He forms a well with his scraper, then fills the well with a mixture of roughly 3/4 water to 1/4 construction-grade bonding glue. He adds just the right amount of plaster of Paris, which is powdered gypsum, the same stuff they use to make casts for broken bones. He takes his trowel and thoroughly blends the lime compound, glue mixture, and plaster of Paris. When it has the consistency of pudding, the plaster is ready. The plasterman does all this by eye, without ever actually measuring a single ingredient. After applying bonding glue to the repair area, the other plasterman trowels on lots of plaster. Then he takes what's called a circular running mold. Its profile is that of the existing molding. He runs it back and forth over the wet plaster, hence the term running mold. He carefully scrapes away the excess and runs a wet paintbrush over the new and old portions of the molding. This makes the transition between the two appear seamless and smooths out any imperfections. To make the running molds, he cuts out a cross-section of the existing molding and traces it to produce a sheet metal template with the same profile. With that, he cuts the shape in wood, producing what they call a stock. After sanding the stock smooth, he screws the metal template to it. The wood backing prevents the metal from bending as he runs it over thick plaster. He screws more wood to the stock to form a handle. To make crown moldings, the plasterman mounts a track to guide his running mold. He checks for anchor screws obstructing the path. If he finds any, he drives them a bit further into the ceiling. He brushes on bonding glue and lets it set for 5 minutes. Then he begins applying the plaster in sizeable globs. He passes the running mold over the plaster. He repeats several times with additional plaster, waiting 20 minutes or so between coats to let the plaster harden just enough to hold the shape. He applies the final coat by hand, filling in crevices and imperfections. Then he passes the running mold one last time. The wet plaster molding takes anywhere from 48 to 72 hours to dry, depending on its size and on the humidity in the room. Only when the molding is completely dry can the plasterman begin the next step, crafting the corner pieces, called miters. Starting with larger knives and scrapers, he uses the edge of the adjacent moldings as a guide, adding some plaster, sculpting it, then removing the excess. He keeps repeating these steps until each side of the miter matches the molding it joins perfectly. It's a slow and meticulous process that takes patience and an expert eye. Once he's perfected the profile, he refines the edges with smaller knives and scrapers. Finally, he blends the surface with a wet brush, rendering the transition from miter to molding visually seamless. brand new, yet distinctly old world.